Good evening and a warm welcome to the Expert Talk series. My name is Akil Rashid and I am the Research and Knowledge Hub Chief at JKPI, Jammu and Kashmir Policy Institute. The Expert Talk series is aimed at engaging experts, changemakers, pioneers from various walks of life to understand the dynamic context of implementing the UN Sustainable Development Goals on our agenda. In the previous sessions of the Expert Talk series, our guest speakers helped us source inputs and recommendations pertaining to different sustainable development goals from their shared expertise, lived experiences, and policy analysis through one-on-one dialogues. Tonight, I'm honored to be able to be here to introduce Tamanna Slatia, who will explore synergies between youth, peace and security, and women, peace and security. Tamanna Slatia is a feminist peace builder and youth activist based in Jammu and Kashmir. She is working towards inclusive conflict transformation for over 8 years. As part of her efforts in mainstreaming gender in peace building processes and projects, she has also worked as a mentor for a group of young peace builders in Sri Lanka for UN volunteers and is a leadership trainer for young peace builders globally. Working on SDG 16, Peace, Justice and Stronger Institutions, with a focus on localizing SCR to 2250 Youth, Peace and Security and SCR 1325 Women, Peace and Security. She advocates for and facilitates a large role of youth and women in peace building and conflict transformation. On behalf of the entire team of JKPI, I welcome you. Thank you very much for taking the time to be with us. Now, I would like to pass on the mantle to Ms. Sohni, our facilitator for the evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Akil, for the detailed introduction. Welcome, Tamanna, to our Expert Talk series, a series which is designed to bring more of the experiences of grassroots practitioners and people on the ground to the policy-making table. So we are honored to have you here today. And as a fellow peace builder, let me begin by telling you how much I admire your work and how much I have always looked up to you as someone I can learn from. So having said that, we are obviously eager to learn more. So let's dive straight in, shall we? Yes. So the first thing which we would want to know from you is that from your experience of working in a very conservative society like Jammu and Kashmir as it stands today, I do understand that Jammu and Kashmir's society has changed over time and has evolved. The situation is not the same in the context of how the conflict has evolved because of that. But what has your experience been when you've been working on feminist peace building processes in Jammu and Kashmir, that too in the current context of the culture and society of Jammu and Kashmir? I'd like to know some of your experiences from the ground.
Well, I do agree that the society in Jammu and Kashmir is much more conservative than in other places all around the world that I've worked in. My experience, particularly as a young person, like in my early 20s when I started out, was that people were not only not willing to listen to me, but with all the hard work that people like me were putting on the ground, our accumulated data, the analysis we were doing, the kind of predictions we were making with respect to conflict in the state was just pushed aside, like it did not matter at all. We were not trusted as young people to be able to find solutions to the problems that the erstwhile state was facing at that time. But my experience, particularly as a young woman peace builder in the state, was much worse, because there's definitely not just discrimination against women, that too young women, but a lot of gender-based violence that happens, and I have experienced that. We work in peace and security, but it's not at all safe at all for us to work in building peace in the Union Territory as it is for probably young men who do the same work. So my experience as a young women peace builder was very disappointing, scary at times, but most of the times it was the pain of not being heard in spite of probably doing more than people who were older or in age or were probably cis-het men. So this is what, I mean, I kind of agree that it is challenging to work in a conservative society. It does has its own, own beauty of its own too, because then you get to break the ceilings that are in place in terms of age and gender barriers and everything. But challenges are there definitely.
Thank you, Tamanna. You spoke about your experience so far, but clearly when you started working and with the aspirations you started working with, you must have seen the scope of implementation of maybe the women peace and security agenda and the youth peace and security agenda in Jammu and Kashmir, and broadly also in India. We know there is somewhat of there has been a resistance of sorts before. Now things are gradually moving towards a more acceptable, towards a more acceptable place where women peace and security and youth peace and security is something that people are talking about and considering as factors to take into account while indulging in the policy planning processes. What would you say is the scope of such work? How do you see or envision this kind of work and the synergies shaping the policy planning process in Jammu and Kashmir?
See, definitely the scope of implementing both WPS and youth peace and security agenda are immense, but so are the need. In India, narrative around participation of youth in peace and security is still at the level where the YPS itself begins. Like we still see youth who want to be more active participants as threat rather than, resources to reach to a more peaceful country and society. So I think that spans out a lot of scope that we still have to work upon. So it will give us a framework to just start, a shift in narrative of how we view our youth. And in that, maybe we could figure out our own localized ways in which we could utilize our youth purge that's happening. So I think that's one. And when it comes to women, peace and security, we have been kind of shying away from it for too long now. It's been 20 long years. And the answer in that lies also in how politically we view our young women and women in general, who are working towards peace and security in the country. So that's one area where we could begin. So because there's very little political representation of women in the country. So the exclusion of them from, the peace and security agenda narratives and such policies is, I think that's where it kind of limits. So that's where we should begin the YPS and WPS agenda implementation in the country by just creating a space first.
So what would you say, how does this YPS and WPS agenda, how do they complement each other? Like in your experience, if you have to maybe suggest to policymakers how they can be complemented. I mean, we look at youth and then we look at young women or women in general as two different sectors generally. And it's not very marked out. So for that purpose, like how would you say they complement each other, these agendas?
I think definitely they do complement each other, because even in WPS, there is certain kind of gerontocracy that we have experienced all over the world. So young women are very excluded from the WPS in general, that we have noticed, the workings, the consultations around it, the discussions around it. But at the same time, when we talk about YPS, it's still a very a patriarchal setting in which we can start imagining the implementation of YPS in our country. So young women are left out by both of these agendas when it comes to, I talk about like India and then Jammu and Kashmir especially. So they do complement each other, because when we talk about YPS and WPS together, we actually find a gap that these two agendas have left in our conflict zone and region. And we can begin seeing how both of these agendas, when implemented separately, actually not just exclude, but fail young women who are working on ground, who are in need of protection, who are in need of an increased representation and participation. So I think it's very clear how they're very complementary to each other. You can't have one without the other, because then you have a huge section of young women who are actually making a difference on ground being left out totally.
That's interesting, because the next question I was actually coming to was about the gaps. So from a gender perspective, what are the significant gaps that remain to be addressed in these resolutions? In terms of localization, what are the barriers to the effective implementation of these two resolutions? And how do cultural and social norms affect this process?
I think the biggest barrier yet is how we still view of our youth, young peace builders, when they raise a voice and when they mobilize, when they start acting and raising a voice, they are seen as a threat. And you're seeing in the country, they are being, um, being limited, law is used against them. So instead of empowering them, we're still, using the lack of these agendas and their implementation in the country still pushes the same old narrative that if there is more youth in the country, there's going to be more restlessness and hence more violence probably. And that's how we see, the same narrative being narrated in how we treat our youth when they start mobilizing together. So that's the biggest gap that YPS has not yet addressed, like how to break that barrier of perception, like how to actually initiate. We do tell that, okay, young people are not the participants in violence, but also, key builders of peace. But then the gap in between, like how do you make that push from being seen as people engaging in violence, the restless segment of the population, to actually being the decision makers and change makers.
That's very interesting. Reminds me of the first time when I stepped into the field of peace building. And I remember that when I would use the word peace builder, who am I? I'm a peace builder. I remember even in my society and culture, everything was like, you've heard about youth and other stuff, but you've never heard of youth and peace building. Like, what is it? The term was even something new. I think even when it comes to our culture, there is no concept of youth and peacemaking or peace building. Do you have any observations on the same?
I think, yes, I do, especially when we talk about Kashmir, like how most projects that are implemented for, de-radicalization and peace building actually see youth as engaging in certain kind of activities. I rarely see a beginning point in projects and peace processes that makes the assumption that, okay, youth are actually the ones on ground dealing face on with the problems and then creating solutions. I think that's also, I mean, we have not yet arrived at that question, but that's also the one of the very key parts of localization of these agendas. You look at the specific area in which you see that, okay, the youth in this region are actually leading the efforts in a certain way. For example, I think one way that we have not yet explored YPS in J&K context is the religious, how youth in the religious networks, how they get together and how they use religion and spirituality to engage in peaceful discussions rather than be engaged in a radicalized version of the same. So this is also a part that I think we should really not miss out on. I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? I think we digressed like something.
No, you did not digress. I was actually coming to that. So we were actually working on how, like, my question was aimed to also address this fact that when you look at the localization aspect and when you look at youth in Jammu and Kashmir, there is more of a narrative around how the youth are being mobilized towards violence and towards destructive activities. And there is probably no concept of youth in peace building. Like, we don't get to hear much about that outside. And even in the context of Bengal, from where I hail, I did not exactly come across a popular cultural narrative that supports peace building processes or peace building activities. Somewhere these kind of activities and ideas and community work is not something that is probably known or people are not exactly aware of, and not much of it is even publicized. So maybe that's why I wouldn't say that there hasn't been activities, but that is what, in the localization process, in the context of Jammu and Kashmir, that's what I exactly wanted to know.
Yeah. I think that also has a lot to do with the lens with which we look at youth, especially the decision-making bodies, the governments, the funding agencies, the donors. We never, for example, how many young people would you be aware of who are mobilizing youth for violence? I think very few. And since I work on the ground, I'm aware of more youth-led groups and individuals, young individuals actually making a difference. Especially, for example, in COVID times, you can see very clearly how young people with barely any formal knowledge and training in mobilization and first response are leading the way. So this is the power of youth. I think the network that they have, and they're not limited by years of conditioning into how the government systems work, healthcare systems work. They know just one thing, that they have to act, and they have to act in the best way possible. So the lens with which the decision-making bodies and people who hold part look at youth needs to shift. The youth are doing, great. They're doing well. They are on ground. If you look at most people who are challenging the conflict narratives and also the narratives that kind of push towards violence, war, youth are there on ground to challenge them. But really, do we see any peace processes that begin from that perspective? So we always begin from the perspective that, okay, this is a region where there's a youth bulge, and we need to see how to engage those youth. I think we need to empower the young people already, doing the good. That is a shift in perspective that needs to happen.
Indeed. In fact, I've heard this quite a lot about engaging the youth. So presuming that they're not engaged already, but not looking at how to empower them in order to facilitate their engagement further with more effective outcomes, probably. Very interesting point you raised there, Taman.
And also, like, I have something to add. The thought process that we need to engage the youth itself is very discriminatory, and which is precisely why we need YPS in India, and especially in Jammu and Kashmir, because we come from our own set of half-baked data points, and we say, okay, this is the way we need to engage the youth. But you need to listen to the youth. They will guide you in what help do they need from you and what support they need from you. The engagement part, I think the youth are pretty much capable of carrying out themselves. So it's also very condescending, this train of thought.
Little patronizing too, in a certain sense. Indeed. We are all suffering from the same thing everywhere, whether it be Jammu and Kashmir or Bengal. I know that definitely while working in the field of religion and peace building, because I often work with elders and community leaders who have always looked at this whole top-down hierarchy as something that they are the custodians of and they need to protect, and not to have like something of an equal mutual learning dialogue. So that's a very important point. And yes, indeed, our institutionalized bodies are also following suit, and that's unfortunate, but let's hope that things change. Now, coming to the women, peace and security agenda, what I would like to know from you next is, how do you think women's full and meaningful participation in the peace and security process can help in the effectiveness and durability of peace agreements? So how do you think that, how women engage in this process would probably help in a kind of a resolution to probably, in the context of Kashmir conflict, of course, what could change if women's full participation is encouraged?
Yeah, I think I would like to modify the question a bit. We are way beyond the times where we just need I mean, of course, we do not yet have full or even meaningful participation of women yet in peace processes, but we need to start thinking about not just women's participation, but women's leadership in peace process and peace building, the whole narrative, because that is the real change that's going to happen. If you look at any unit in a community, if you look at the community or the smallest unit, even a family, which is a family, you see how women are actually the center of it all. So empowering the center and actually, enhancing her capabilities to lead from that perspective, her entire community. You see how a ripple effect happens when you put a woman in place of, who's already in a place of power in her family, in her community, in a place of power at the peace table. I think that kind of empowerment needs to take place. So instead of just the entire dialogue revolving around increasing participation of women, we need to start talking about it in terms of women's leadership, because women are natural leaders, and I think even researchers support that. We just need to utilize that.
So as you say that, women are natural leaders and it is important to support women's leadership. Now, this is something I want to bring up based on my own observations, very limited though, you definitely know a lot more. But there's something that I have noticed is the norm in Kashmir, as much as I've seen, is that even though women are like the fulcrum of the families, they're holding families together. And they are the ones who are, keeping the emotional equilibrium in place when it comes to their communities as well. But whenever the point of a woman going out and leading comes, like the whole idea, there is an attached, you can say, scare, or maybe an attached dread when it comes to she being targeted as in terms of her community honor, and that leadership is like an uncharted path or something, and there is going to be a repercussion. So there always has to be a surveillance, there always has to be an influence, there always has to be a way of guiding that leadership to, again, very male-centered lens, through a very male-centered lens, for ends that are more, male focused. That is, the outcome is more male focused, and it's not exactly a very inclusive way of looking at the prospect of women's leadership also. So being a Kashmiri, like being from Kashmir yourself and having worked on field, what would you say, why is this, if I, first of all, tell me if I have read this correctly, and second of all, you can also educate me on the fact that if I have read this factor, this sense correctly as a woman myself, then what do you think would be the solution? How do you even bring women out of their homes, encourage them to participate in leadership, to take up leadership initiatives on their own, if there is always this fear, there's always this surveillance, there's always this sense of control? How do women even step out of that to proceed towards leadership? Is that even a concept that exists in Kashmir?
Yes, I would like to answer that from my experience in Kashmir and Jammu, from where I come. See, there's this cultural barrier, it's all because of the patriarchy that surrounds us, hence the need for a feminist peace building, from ground up. So, see, since it's all cultural, that's also, I would like to link it to your previous question. That's also one of the biggest barriers in localizing WPS and YPS in terms of young women culturally. You see, women are natural leaders, but the patriarchal society sees women stepping up to actual decision making in the peace processes as a threat, rather than a resource or rather than something to be celebrated. So I think there's no other way than just challenging that a patriarchal notion that your owner or your honor is in a woman. I think we're way past that. It's 21st century, and there's no better way than to challenge it directly. And a lot of women that I know in Kashmir, young women, are doing that. They're handling it quite well. It's the legal and other government mechanisms that fail to protect us young women who do challenge that. That's where I think that's what we need to talk about more. Women are already doing their part. They are challenging the limitations, the barriers to them spreading their wings. But often at times, the legal systems, even the smallest governance systems, for example, they fail us. So we need to I think, amp up our protection mechanisms for such young women who are working for peace. And also, I would like to say that same, I mean, just following up from legal and governance things, political empowerment and increasing political participation of women is important too, because I remember my experience after the abrogation of Article 370. I visited a village along the border with Pakistan in Samba district. And for the first time ever, that village, which is the last village on that border, you know, like pretty close, a couple of kilometers of distance from the border. The first time in all those years since independence, that village had a proper pakka road. And when asked that how did this happen, the unanimous answer was, especially from very young school going girls, that it was because for the first time we have a woman serpent. So you see how, yeah, how the results are there for us to see. We just need to, as governing bodies, as you know, the legal custodians, we just need to provide them with that protection that, okay, the work that they are doing, we support them in that. I hope that answered your question, though.
Absolutely. In
I
fact,
get
it went far
lost
and beyond.
that I recount.
So that's exactly what we want from you, Tamanna. That's exactly what we're seeking. And we're really grateful that you're bringing in your personal experiences and giving us examples. We would definitely want to get in touch with you more to learn more about the female serpent and you know, how her work, because that's not something that we learn of much. I mean, I've myself visited a couple of villages and tried to have conversations with punches and sarpanches, and my experience to this day has been that even if there were women officials linked to the panchayat who were there, they weren't exactly the ones speaking about taking any initiative. They were just there just for the sake of it. And it is really heartening to learn that there are such you know, such instances of political mobilization and political participation of women, and to this kind of ends. That's wonderful. So
you
now,
were actually very happy to know. I'm so sorry to interrupt you. So I'm not going to take any names or divulge the region because of the safety and security. So I know of many such young women in, you know, Jammu province, and now getting ready in Kashmir province also, who in their early 20s are ready to like contest local elections. And so, yeah, I think it would be great to, you know, probably even if JKPI gets to talk to them and
that
kind
would
of
be lovely.
support them.
We'd love to do a survey or something and like have more interviews, and definitely get in touch with you on that. Alongside that, now let's come to the effectiveness of policy first. So for the development of any effective policy where we have like a very evidence-based policy making approach, it's important to have concrete data, as you know. But there is a significant lack of sex and age disaggregated data. What could be done to resolve this? Do we still have reluctance towards any such an approach, or reluctance towards actually documenting such data? And why do you think that happens?
I think very obvious, but we need more data. So we should go get it. We should talk to people, you know, talk to young people, women, and everyone. But I think, of course, there is reluctance to do that. Also, because not just because the task is humongous, but because in asking people what they want, what the issues are, this, you know, the transparency would have to increase in the kind of solutions that you're going to provide to them. So we definitely need to have more data on that, because unless you know who are the people who are getting affected by the issues, like how do the issues affect them personally, as a community, as a region, as probably, you know, a state, a country, unless you do that, you would never know what is the best possible solution to them. So it's, of course, you know, the more data never hurts anybody, but also sometimes young women, the demography gets lost in the, like how you mentioned before, on how, you know, these two groups are seen as homogeneous groups. So which is why I think data is more important to also to bring out, you know, the intersectionality of it all. Like, okay, this is a group of young people, these are the young women, these are the young women who come from marginalized groups. And it's very important for us to now know all these like the subgroups, because for a long time, which happened in WPS also, we ignored the intersectionality. We were just still, focusing on getting more women, but we did not ensure that we had women from diverse, not just age groups, but also from various marginalized groups, that the same limitations, the same discriminations that are in the society that we are trying to change do not creep up in the systems and solutions that we have built to change them.
Indeed. I don't know how you're predicting my questions, but then this was exactly the question I was about to ask you about the intersectionality approach that is woefully lacking, and that definitely hurts the inclusiveness of any process. But one more thing which, as a grassroots peace builder, really interests me personally, and something I'd like to ask you is about how do you see youth and young women coming together to work? Because as we know that there is a lack of gender sensitization in Jammu and Kashmir, and as in any other conflict region, it is turning out to be a hyper-masculine culture, which is a result of the aggression. So in that sense, if you have to talk about synergies to do with YPS and WPS, and you have to bring young women into community processes to lead, what would you say is the role and scope of gender sensitization in that process? Like, how do you see the lack of gender sensitization perhaps affecting the process? And how do you think a policy approach to support such processes of gender sensitization can perhaps help us integrate this, the synergical space of YPS and WPS more effectively at a community level?
I think gender sensitization is indispensable to all parts of WPS and YPS and all levels of our policies and the projects that we implement on ground across, stakeholders. So it's very indispensable. But more than that, we need to start giving young women the power and the pedestal where their voices listened to. Many times, even in YPS network circles, you would have noticed we have cishet men occupying positions of not just power but also of amplification, of being placed central to particular networks. So young women get further marginalized, and that happens also kind of automatically because of how our societies function across the world. I would say, women are discriminated against, networks within networks, and the only way to, I think, transcend that is to place them at the center of it all, to give them a pedestal where their voice would have to be heard. So that's where we begin. I think, in a way, I'm not talking about like formal reservations, but the idea of having like reserving voice, decision-making powers in the peace-making system, peace-building systems that you have built as young people is also important. So I'm also looking at it from the perspective of from within the young peace-building groups, like not just from outside, but young people everywhere need to start rethink their systems. Do they exclude women? Do they exclude women from marginalized communities further? Are they being ageist, like not ageist of course, but ableist, casteist, classes? So these are the things that young people also need to start thinking and talking about.
Indeed, that's quite a lot to think about, Adito, isn't it? But yeah, that is true. I completely agree with you. This is just something that was in my mind when I was thinking about the possibility of having more young peace builders coming.
I'm so sorry I interrupted you. I feel so bad about it, but I realized how what I just said about accountability within young peace builders groups and networks. I think that's for us young peace builders to think about, and it should not and must not be used at all by the elder age group, young peace builders, or even the governments or bigger peace building networks to even start, I think, preaching to young people about that. That's our own accountability circle, and not for others to further, dominate us upon. So their approach to like gender sensitization and gender lens to the peace building processes must come more like a support and not like probably something that is imposed on young people. So informal policies within informal groups probably would be more like to see it as.
Informal processes within informal groups. That's interesting. Maybe that would also bring up a new narrative, maybe the narrative change, who knows. So the next question I have for you is that you talked about a narrative change since young people are still seen more as a threat than a resource. In that sense, what would be your recommendations? Like what could policymakers begin with to change that narrative? Because it's not going to change in a day, but there could perhaps be certain things that they take into account which would actually initiate this change of perspective. What would be your recommendations on the same?
My top recommendation is listen to us. Like just listen to us. It's been years of policies being made about us, and sometimes even the lack of policies. So start listening to us. There's literally enough fodder for all the policy makers and other support systems around them to bring out a more more localized solutions that would actually have the capacity to work out. So start by listening to young people, start by listening to young women, like what would make them feel more protected, what would give them more power to bring tangible change. So start listening to people, young people.
Well, in a culture where disagreement is seen as disobedience by the elders, listening comes quite at a cost. It takes time, I guess. So that's also something very, very cultural. So the next question which I have is, as you know, we still have very limited opportunities for youth in both academics as well as having practical experiences in this field. What role can civil society organizations and think tanks play to bridge that gap? Because this is true. This is something even I have faced when I was growing as a peace builder over the last 5 to 6 years. There is a woeful gap in terms of the kind of knowledge and exposure that students from different fields have when it comes to the way they can link their experiences to the field of policymaking and peace building and integrate the same. So what would you say is the role of civil society and particularly think tanks to facilitate such engagement?
I think before talking about the roles that they have to play, I would talk about what has led to that gap. Young people are treated by these organizations, networks, decision makers as tokens. Like it's still happening. So until that changes, until we start not just giving more responsibilities, but also like more space to young people to take those decisions rather than just be present as a token member. So that needs to start, like it has to shift. You have to not just get young people and listen to them, but also trust them to be enablers of change, to bring in, usher in that peace. So, and I think the very thought that young people mostly resist and don't really, because this is a very powerful narrative in a lot of established civil society organizations that I've had a chance to interact with, that young people mostly resist and they do not really bring in the change, sustained change. That has to come from within the civil society's organizations themselves. Like just give young people a chance. Don't just invite them to discussions, listen to them, but also take your decisions, like form your projects, your programs according to what young people have to offer.
That's an interesting perspective indeed. Over here, I'd just like to add to your reflections a little bit on how the academic space for youth does not exactly facilitate engagement in peace building. Like there is a woeful lack that is seen, and particularly over here in our part of the world. I mean, in the West, you have a lot of, you have these engagements and capstone projects, and then you have think tanks having their chapters, and a lot of these interactions, very real-time interactions, which shape the young people to step into fields of decision making. But that lack here is something that is very, very evident. And one of the reasons why I think, and this is from a perspective of career coach that I've come to this discussion, is that probably because we have a very job-oriented academic approach to preparing students, and not exactly preparing them to engage with life in a very, adaptable and change maker mode. They're not taught the skills, or they're not given the kind of exposure to grow into even the mindset of change makers. It's not like they don't want to, they do want to, but it's not like they're guided into the process in a way that saves them time, that saves them energy, and a lot of turmoil, which can often even be demoralizing. I mean, reflecting on my own experiences, I know that it hasn't been an easy ride for me stepping into a field which I knew nothing about. I did not receive much support from my community or my culture. I had nowhere to go, but it was thankfully because of the internet probably that this generation is doing a lot of self-learning and unlearning on their own. But given the fact that there is always this chance of being, pushed into something wrong, or being pulled towards something wrong, as much as the internet can be a resource, there is no guided mentorship. There's no guided, approach to leading young minds to understand how to move into this role of a change leader, of being a leader who would actually facilitate this kind of engagement and curriculum, having a very informed approach and a very keen and keen and foresightful, if I may say, approach to looking at the future. So it becomes more about just wanting a change, but not thinking it through in terms of sustainability, perhaps. Those who don't come with training, those who don't get that support, and that you have a system that probably does not have an approach of listening to the youth and factoring in their inputs while designing facilities that engage their growth abilities. That is where I think much of that, much of the scope is lost, much of that potential is lost. And becomes all about engaging the youth in a way that is more show than it actually has substance to help them grow. But that's just my observation.
I'm so glad that you said it. And I have actually quite a number of points to add to that. We, in our part of the world, we have, especially in the subcontinent, we have miserably failed to, let alone tap into, even recognize the potential that our youth hold. In not just transforming the conflict, but in bringing some real change. So one thing is that, another is the exploitation of young people that takes place. We just see them as numbers, like a huge demography that we can use in terms of numbers, and not just in terms of transforming that into something like using their potential to actually make a difference. So either it's that, like you said, excluding them, just using them for showing strength. So one is that. Another is that if not that, then we exploit them, use them, like misuse them as resources just to be used, but not enhance. Their capabilities are not built upon, they're not supported in that, because there's also a lot of insecurity in sorry to say that, no offense to the elder generation of peace builders and change makers, there's a lot of insecurity in the kind of bulging new youth, new energy that this generation brings, of like we are not ready to wait. We are ready to patiently make change, but we kind of, I think the way things are happening, at least in India, that I can say, we will patiently bring in change, but we will begin now. Like we'll not wait anymore. So there's a lot of insecurity in people about that aspect of the potential that young people bring into peace building. And also, I think there's a very important, this is an important point too, being someone who started, who's been building peace on ground, I was neither very aware of the academic side of it, neither the global conversations or the global language around it. I still do not have that, if you would notice. In spite of that, the work I'm doing was real, and it had the potential to transform into sustainable peace for the region. But because this kind of informal work, which is making a difference, is not recognized as in the systems that we follow from the West usually. So there's a greater need for recognizing and developing our own indigenous as well as localized peace processes and peace dialogues. I think this is also very important when probably we're talking about Jammu and Kashmir in India, but when you look at Afghanistan, their traditional systems of holding dialogues were not just used, but they were not used, but they were also shunned for being something that is very indigenous. So, like indigenous, and hence probably would not work or wouldn't fit in the Western narrative. So there's also a need to decolonize, peace building from that perspective too needs to be taken into account. That's a whole lot of dimensions to this one conversation.
This conversation could go on and on, believe me, and especially because it's two peace builders coming together to talk about something that has deeply impacted both of us. It is very clear, which is youth peace and security, and of course women peace and security. So now let's come to the fact that there seems to be a blurred line between the field of social work and peace building in India. How does it impact the implementation of the WPS and YPS scenario? Because the concepts of WPS and YPS emerged in the West, but when you're looking at this whole idea of social work in India, there is no clear demarcation of peace building as a field and what facilitates that engagement. So what would you say, how does it impact the implementation of these processes?
I think according to me, women peace and security and youth peace and security agenda, it broadened the definition and working of like peace building. Peace building is not just about security in terms of just defense, but it is also the very realization of, for example, when WPS was brought in, and the very conversation that women peace builders face sexual violence on the field that was not considered before. It kind of like broadened how we looked at peace building. So I think in a way it's not something to worry about, of the blurring of lines between peace building and social work, because the very lines that defined peace building itself have been expanding. So I find it like not like something to worry about. It's something that has a lot of potential that we could use. Like it also helps us in, for example, tapping into the intersectionality bit. For example, there are social workers who are trained to be peace builders would be better able to recognize marginalization that would usually take place in peace processes. So I think it's good that the networks are kind of merging and expanding, because it's good if the walls fall down in a way. I'm all for a very like meaningful anarchy. I'm all for it.
And borderless one, more with networks and connections, if I may say so.
Yeah.
Not to mention, it shows your experience and your wisdom in the field, because you do have an approach of looking at gaps as opportunities for the development, rather than anything that actually stalls growth. That's beautiful, Tamanna. We have come to the close of our today's session. So thank you so very much for being here with us, for sharing with us so generously all your experiences and your wisdom and all your knowledge. We look forward to connecting with you again and making sure that we stay connected, because we have a lot to learn from you, clearly. I know how much I've learned personally today. And last but not the least, thank you for just being you, for doing the incredible work that you've been doing for so long. Like I've mentioned at the very beginning, and I mentioned yet again, as a peer, as a peace builder, as somebody who have known you and your work, it's with deep admiration that I have always upheld you and celebrated you and your work. And we, as an organization, as a team, continue to do so. So we are humbled that you've chosen to be with us today. The thank you note will obviously not end without thanking our lovely audience who have been here with us. And I'm sure they have been hanging on to every word of this riveting discussion. We look forward to more such experiences in the coming future. And with that, we close for tonight. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. I think the entire conversation, it's going to show all the peace builders that work with us, and beyond that, youth peace building and young women leading peace actually is respected and is wanted and is the need. So thank you for that.